Every morning at dawn, the yellow tricycle would appear at the same junction in Lagos, driven by a man who never aged, never ate, and never spoke about his past. But when a curious young journalist named Keke decided to investigate the mysterious Keke driver that everyone trusted but no one truly knew, she uncovered a secret so profound it would shake the foundations of reality itself and reveal that some debts transcend lifetimes and some missions cannot end even in death. This is the hidden truth about the Keke driver that no one is talking about. A story that will change everything you think you know about the ordinary people who move through our lives like ghosts, serving purposes we cannot begin to imagine. They say Lagos never sleeps, but what they do not tell you is that some of those who keep the city moving never sleep either. Because sleep is a luxury reserved for the living, and not everyone navigating Lagos streets still belongs to that category. His name was Emeka, or at least that's what everyone called him, though nobody could remember who first gave him that name or when he actually arrived in the neighborhood. The Keke drivers who gathered at the junction for their morning meetings could recall a time when he was unique among them, his yellow tricycle always immaculately maintained despite being at least 20 years old, its engine purring with impossible smoothness while other drivers struggled with mechanical failures and breakdowns. His fares were always fair, never demanding the inflated prices that other drivers charged during rush hour or rainy days. His passengers always arrived safely, never experiencing the accidents or near misses that plagued Lagos traffic. Children waved to him as he passed. Elderly women trusted him with their market goods. Young professionals relied on him for their morning commute. Yet nobody really knew anything about him beyond his reliability and his kind smile that never quite reached his eyes that held depths of sorrow no living person should possess. Keke first noticed something strange about Emeka during her daily commute to the newspaper office where she worked as an investigative journalist, always searching for stories that others missed, truths hidden beneath surfaces that everyone else accepted without question. She had taken his Keke dozens of times over the months since moving to the neighborhood, appreciating his punctuality and his respectful silence, never pushing conversation on passengers who preferred quiet contemplation during their rides. But one morning as she climbed into his tricycle, she noticed something that made her journalist instincts flare to life like a match struck in darkness. Emeka cast no shadow despite the bright morning sun that painted everything else in sharp relief, creating dark silhouettes of every person and object except him. At first she thought it must be a trick of the light, an optical illusion created by the angle of the sun or the position of the tricycle. But as she paid closer attention over the following days, she realized the truth was far stranger and more impossible than any rational explanation could account for. She began documenting everything, filling notebooks with observations that grew more disturbing with each passing day. Emeka never ate, despite other drivers sharing breakfast and lunch at the junction, always declining with polite excuses that varied but never quite made sense. He never drank water, even on the hottest days when other drivers guzzled bottles to stay hydrated in Lagos heat that could kill the His clothing never changed, always the same faded yellow shirt and brown trousers that looked simultaneously new and ancient, never showing signs of wear, despite being worn every single day. His tricycle never needed fuel, though he would occasionally pull into filling stations and go through the motions of refueling his movements, practiced and convincing, yet she noticed the fuel gauge never actually moved and no money ever changed hands, despite the elaborate pantomime. Most disturbing of all, when she tried to photograph him for her investigation, his image never appeared clearly in pictures, always blurred or distorted as though reality itself refused to properly record his existence, mocking him as something that shouldn't be captured because it shouldn't exist at all. One evening, as the sun set over Lagos in spectacular shades of orange and purple that painted the sky like a cosmic canvas, Keke gathered her courage and decided to confront him directly, to ask the questions that had been burning in her mind for weeks. She found him at the junction after most other drivers had gone home to their families, his tricycle parked in its usual spot, Emeka sitting behind the wheel with his eyes closed, as though sleeping or meditating or perhaps simply not needing to do anything at all because the living impulses that drove human behavior no longer applied to him. "I know what you are," she said softly, approaching with caution despite her boldness, her journalist instincts warring with primal fear that recognized predator even when it wore a friendly face. Emeka's eyes opened slowly, and in them she saw something that confirmed all her suspicions and raised 1,000 new questions. Infinite sadness, endless patience, and the weight of decades or perhaps centuries compressed into a single gaze that had seen Lagos transform from a small settlement into the sprawling megacity it had become. He asked, his voice carrying harmonics that shouldn't exist in human speech, frequencies that resonated in her bones, and made her understand that she was conversing with something fundamentally different from the living people who surrounded her every day. Most people don't want to know the truth about the world around them, preferring comfortable illusions to disturbing realities. What makes you different, Kioma? What makes you willing to see what others refuse to acknowledge? She sat down on the bench beside his tricycle, her legs suddenly unsteady, her breath coming fast as fear and excitement warred within her chest. I'm a journalist. Truth is my profession, my calling, my reason for existing. And you, Emeka, are the biggest truth I've ever encountered. A story that could change everything if only I could understand it and explain it in ways that people would believe rather than dismiss as fantasy or delusion. And so Emeka told her a story that would indeed change everything. A tale that stretched back 40 years to a night that had shaped his existence ever since. He had been a real kick driver once, a living, breathing man with dreams and ambitions and a family he loved more than life itself. His daughter Ngozi had been sick with malaria, the fever burning through her small body with terrifying intensity, and he had needed money for medication that the free clinics could only provide, life-saving drugs that required cash he didn't have despite working 16-hour days navigating Lagos chaos. On that fateful night, desperate and afraid and willing to do anything to save his daughter's life, he had accepted a fare from a stranger who offered triple his usual rate to be taken to an address in a part of Lagos known for its dangerous reputation, an area where even police feared to patrol and where normal rules seemed suspended by mutual agreement of all who dwelt there. The passenger had been strange from the beginning, his skin too pale, his eyes too bright, his smile too wide, marking him as something other than human, though. Emeka's desperation had overridden his instincts that screamed warnings his conscious mind refused to hear. Halfway to the destination, on a dark road where streetlights had long since failed and no other vehicles traveled at that late hour, the passenger revealed his true nature. He was a spirit, an entity from the other side of the veil that separated life from death, and he had a proposition that would solve Emeka's immediate problem while creating a debt that would extend far beyond a single lifetime. I will give you the money you need to save your daughter, the spirit said, its voice echoing with power that made the tricycle's metal frame vibrate sympathetically. But, in exchange, when your natural time comes to die, you will not move on to the ancestors' realm. Instead, you will serve as my agent in the living world, helping souls who need guidance, protecting travelers who face dangers they cannot see, maintaining the balance between worlds by ensuring safe passage for those who move through Lagos streets. You will be a guardian, a protector, a bridge between life and death, serving until the debt is paid through decades of service to humanity. Emeka had agreed, his love for his daughter overriding any consideration of his own fate. Unable to see beyond the immediate crisis to understand the full implications of the bargain he was making with forces beyond human comprehension, the spirit had given him bundles of cash that felt real and spent like real money, but had come from somewhere outside normal economic systems. Currency conjured from belief and need rather than printed by government presses. Ngozi had received her medication and survived, growing into a strong, healthy woman who now had children of her own, completely unaware that her father had sacrificed his afterlife to save her that night 40 years ago. But Emeka had died just 3 months later, not from any illness or accident, but simply because his time had come as the spirit had somehow known it would, his heart stopping quietly in his sleep as though someone had simply turned off a switch that powered his existence.
He should have moved on to the ancestors' realm, should have found peace, and eventually rebirth. But instead he found himself bound to his tricycle, trapped in the role of eternal kick driver, condemned to serve Lagos travelers for decades, with no end in sight, watching his daughter and grandchildren grow while he remained frozen at the edge of death, unable to contact them, unable to explain, unable to do anything but fulfill the bargain he had made in a moment of desperate love. But why does nobody notice? Kioma asked, her mind reeling from the story, trying to reconcile the impossible truth with everything she thought she knew about reality. Why do people take rides from a ghost and never realize what you are? Emeka smiled sadly, and it was the saddest expression she had ever witnessed, containing 40 years of loneliness and service compressed into a single facial gesture. Because people see what they expect to see, what their minds tell them is possible and reasonable. They see a kick driver because that's what they expect to find at a junction in Lagos. Their minds edit out the inconsistencies, the missing shadow, the unchanging appearance, the impossible reliability, because acknowledging those things would mean accepting that reality is far stranger than they're comfortable believing. You see me because you're willing to look beyond surfaces, because your profession has trained you to notice details others miss, because some part of you was always seeking deeper truths than ordinary life provides. Over the following weeks, Kioma rode with Emeka every day, learning the full scope of his supernatural mission that extended far beyond simply transporting people from one location to another. She discovered he could sense when passengers were in danger, taking routes that avoided accidents before they happened, protecting travelers from fates they would never know they had escaped. She learned he sometimes carried spirits disguised as ordinary passengers, helping confused ghosts who did not understand they died reach locations that would allow them to move on to the next stage of existence. She witnessed him appear at accident scenes moments before they occurred, his presence somehow preventing collisions that should have been inevitable, his impossible timing saving lives through mechanisms she couldn't begin to explain. He was maintaining balance, serving a function that kept the city safer than it would otherwise be. One trip at a time, one prevented tragedy at a time, one guided spirit at a time, fulfilling a debt that seemed to have no defined endpoint, no clear criteria for completion, no promise of eventual release from his eternal service. "How do you endure it?" she asked one evening as they sat at the empty junction, the city settling into its brief quiet period between late-night chaos and early-morning resurrection. "How do you keep going knowing you're trapped? Unable to move on? Unable to rest? Unable to see your family even though you can watch them from a distance? How do you maintain kindness and patience when you've been serving this sentence for 40 years with no end in sight?" Emeka looked at her with those ancient eyes that had seen so much suffering and prevented so much more. Because purpose gives meaning to existence, even when that existence is a punishment or a curse. Because every life I save, every spirit I guide, every accident I prevent, makes the debt worth paying. Because my daughter lived and had children, and those children will have children, and my sacrifice enabled that entire lineage to exist and flourish. Because love doesn't end with death, it transforms into service, into protection, into a legacy that extends beyond individual lifetimes. And because... He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of hope, too fragile to speak aloud. "Somewhere in the terms of my bargain there must be an end point, a moment when the debt is considered paid, when I'll finally be released to move onto the peace I've been denied for 4 decades. But Chioma, with her investigative instincts, honed by years of uncovering hidden truths and exposing comfortable lies, suspected the real tragedy of Amaka's story. There was no endpoint, no defined criteria for debt completion, no promise of release because the spirit who had made the bargain had never intended to honor such terms. Emeka was trapped forever, unless someone intervened, unless someone challenged the bargain with knowledge and courage and willingness to risk everything to free a soul who had sacrificed himself for love. She began researching, diving into old texts about spirit bargains and supernatural debts, consulting with babaleos and priestesses who still maintained connections to the old ways that modern Lagos had largely forgotten.
She learned that such bargains could be challenged if someone living was willing to argue the case before the Council of Spirits, a gathering of ancient entities who maintained cosmic law and could overturn unjust agreements. But the price for such advocacy was steep. The living person who challenged a spirit bargain risked their own soul, gambling their afterlife on the justice of their argument and the mercy of beings who viewed human concerns from perspectives spanning millennia. Chioma made her decision with the same courage that had driven her journalism career, the same commitment to truth that had led her to investigate Emeka in the first place. She would challenge the bargain, would argue before the Council of Spirits that 40 years of service had more than repaid a single night's worth of money, that a debt born from love and desperation shouldn't result in eternal servitude, that justice demanded Emeka be released to finally find the peace he had been denied for decades. Emeka protested, horrified that she would risk herself for his sake, but she was adamant, her determination unwavering. "You saved your daughter 40 years ago," she told him, her voice fierce with conviction. "You've saved countless others since then, preventing accidents and guiding spirits and maintaining balance in ways people will never even know to be grateful for. Someone needs to save you now. And apparently I'm the someone who sees clearly enough to do it." The summoning ritual took place at midnight at the same junction, where Emeka had been serving for 40 years, a location now charged with spiritual significance from decades of supernatural activity and countless prevented tragedies. Chioma stood in a circle drawn with sacred chalk, calling upon the Council of Spirits with words taught to her by priestesses who remembered the old ways, invoking ancient names that resonated across multiple dimensions of reality. The air shimmered and tore, and suddenly they were no longer in Lagos but somewhere else entirely, a space that existed outside normal geography, a courtroom that transcended physical architecture with walls made of starlight and floors composed of compressed time and judges who appeared as impossibly complex geometric patterns that hurt human eyes to perceive directly. The spirit who had made the original bargain with Emeka appeared as well, its form now revealed as something vast and terrible and utterly an entity that viewed mortal lives as resources to be exploited, contracts to be enforced without regard for the compassion or flexibility that justice requires. Kiyoma argued her case with passion and logic and moral clarity that impressed even the ancient beings who served as judges, laying out the facts of Emeka's sacrifice and service, demonstrating how 40 years of preventing tragedies and guiding spirits had created value far exceeding the original debt, appealing to principles of fairness that transcended cultural boundaries and existed as fundamental truths recognized across all sentient existence. The spirit counted that bargains was sacred, that eternal servitude had been clearly specified in the terms Emeka accepted, that releasing him would set dangerous precedent, encouraging others to challenge agreements they had willingly entered into, regardless of consequences. The council deliberated in frequencies beyond human hearing, communicating in dimensions perpendicular to human consciousness, weighing arguments with scales that measured souls rather than words. Finally, after what felt like hours but might have been seconds or centuries in that space outside normal time, they rendered their judgment. The bargain would be modified, they declared, because while agreements must be honored, justice also requires proportionality and recognition that debts paid with 4 decades of selfless service exceed the value of a single night's money. Emeka would be released from his eternal servitude, but on one condition: he must train a replacement. Someone willing to take up the mantle of supernatural kick driver and continue maintaining the balance he had preserved for 40 years. And that someone, the council declared, with what might have been amusement in beings capable of such emotion, should be the young journalist who had demonstrated courage and moral clarity sufficient for the role, who had already proven willing to risk everything for justice, who possessed the sight necessary to perceive spirits and the compassion necessary to guide them. Kiyoma's heart stopped, realizing what they were suggesting. Understanding that in saving Emeka, she had volunteered herself for the same fate she sought to free him from. But then Emeka spoke, his voice resonating with authority earned through 40 years of faithful service, demanding to be heard by beings who rarely tolerated mortal interruptions. If a replacement is needed, he said, then let it be someone who volunteers freely with full knowledge of what they're accepting, not someone trapped by consequence of their own compassion. Let the position be offered to those who seek purpose, who need redemption, who wish to serve something greater than themselves. There are souls in Lagos who would consider this a blessing rather than a curse, who would welcome the opportunity to make their deaths meaningful through decades of service to the living. The council considered this, their complex geometric forms shifting and rotating in patterns that might have indicated contemplation or might have been something entirely beyond human interpretation. Finally, they agreed. The position would be offered to volunteers, spirits of the recently dead who wished to serve rather than immediately move on, creating a rotation of supernatural kick drivers who would each serve for a defined period before being released to continue their journey toward rebirth, turning Emeka's curse into a sacred duty that souls would compete for the honor of fulfilling. Emeka was free, released from his tricycle and his eternal obligation after 40 years of faithful service that had saved countless lives and guided hundreds of confused spirits to their proper destinations. He could finally move on to the ancestors' realm, could finally rest and eventually be reborn with no memory of his long service, except perhaps a vague inclination toward helping others and an inexplicable fondness for yellow tricycles. But before he went, he spent one final day riding through Lagos streets with Kiyoma, showing her all the near he had prevented over the decades, all the lives he had saved without their knowledge, all the spirits he had guided toward peace. They visited his daughter without her knowing, watching her play with her grandchildren in a compound that existed because of Emeka's sacrifice 40 years earlier. "Thank you," he told Kiyoma, as the sun set on his last day in the liminal space between life and death. "Thank you for seeing me when everyone else looked through me. Thank you for caring enough to risk everything for a ghost you barely knew. Thank you for proving that some people still value justice more than safety, truth more than comfort." Kiyoma wrote the story, of course, because she was a journalist and truth was her calling regardless of whether people would believe it. The article was published in the newspaper, creating sensation and controversy in equal measure, with some readers convinced and others dismissive, some recognizing their own experiences with impossible rescue and others certain it was creative fiction rather than investigative journalism. But at the junction where Emeka had served for 40 years, a new kick driver appeared the next morning. A young man with kind eyes and a yellow tricycle that never needed fuel, already helping passengers and preventing disasters, and guiding confused spirits toward their destinations. The rotation had begun, with volunteers lining up for the honor of serving Lagos in ways invisible to most who benefited from their protection, maintaining the balance between worlds one ride at a time, transforming death from ending into purpose, from loss into service, from curse into sacred duty. This is the hidden truth about the kick driver that no one is talking about. The The secret that runs through Lego streets every morning and evening, as supernatural guardians disguised as ordinary transportation, workers move among the living, protecting, and guiding and serving purposes most passengers never imagined. The next time you take a kick and arrive safely, despite impossible traffic, the next time a driver takes an unexpected route that somehow avoids disaster, the next time you feel strangely protected during your commute through chaotic streets, remember Emeka's story and consider that perhaps you're being driven by someone who exists between worlds, fulfilling debts born from love, maintaining balance through service, proving that even death cannot end dedication to protecting others. And remember that the most ordinary-seeming people around us might be carrying extraordinary secret-serving missions. We cannot begin to understand maintaining the fabric of reality through acts of service so subtle we mistake them for coincidence rather than recognizing them as the miracles they truly are. This is Lagos, when nothing is quite as it seems, where spirits drive tricycles and journalists risk their souls for justice, where love transcends death and debt transforms into sacred purpose that will continue long after we've all moved on to whatever comes next.